Firstly, can you tell me a bit about your background and your training?
Sure. I was born in Norwich. My family generally worked the land, and my father had 5 brothers, all of whom were working on the land. My father didn't like the idea of it and went into the city, which is why I was born in Norwich. When I left school, I went to Norwich Art School and did foundation for a year, and then I did a 4-year degree course at Newcastle University, Fine Art, specialising in sculpture. I only ever wanted to be a sculptor. I was a real pain. And then when I finished at Newcastle, I went down to the Slade in London, so I did 2 years postgraduate. I was a very fortunate student. I had 7 years of a grant, free grant. It was a really sensational time to be a student and to do that. When I left the Slade, I kind of didn't know really how to do it, how to get enough money to make work. So it seemed like a good idea to become an artist in residence or something like that. So I went off to Gloucestershire College of Art and Design in Cheltenham, had a fellowships called that thing where you could apply. They gave you a limited amount of money, and for 1 day's teaching they gave you a studio, and I spent a year in Cheltenham. And then when that was over, I just cast around until I get some more. So basically that's what I did, and then I got into teaching, so I basically had a teaching course, which enabled me to have enough money to end up in this situation, which I consider to be a luxury.
And what initially drew you to using agricultural tools in your work?
Well, everyone says, of course, it's my agricultural background, but actually I didn't have an agricultural background because my father was in Norwich, so I had I grew up in the 50s in Norwich, and it was an industrial city, so I'm not quite sure. I've always been fascinated by tools. And I think the idea of a tool, because we have such an intimate relationship with tools, I mean, not just gardening tools, but any tool. If you work with a tool for any length of time, you develop a relationship to it that is very close, and you know exactly what it will do under certain conditions. And I think I've always had the idea that tools can be manipulated into something else. But I think that's where it started. And because a lot of my ancestors were clearing out their garden sheds and stuff of tools, there were tools there, and these were the kind of tools that were there. They were there, and so I started off using a lot of the Catchpole clan tools in my work. Basically, I get the tool, rip the handle off, rebuild the handle, and just use the blade or whatever it was. And so that's probably where it started. But I mean, I was always fascinated with that Duchamp idea of the tool as a surreal object, implying lots of other things. You know, you've got a tool, a spade. Do you know that's Duchamp sculpture in Advance of a Broken Arm? You know, it's basically a shovel, a snow shovel. But it's like, it implies a lot of activity within itself because we're all familiar with what the tool does. So that's basically it. But that was where my fascination came from, and because of where I was and my background, I suppose I had access to the tools to use. So yeah, there we go.
And how long have you been working with tools?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's probably about 15 years, something like that, a long time. And I started as a welder when I was making work. 20 years ago, I was basically welding, making steel sculpture, all sorts of steel sculpture. Some of it's semi-figurative, some of it abstract. And it was only almost incidentally that I fell into making tools, because I started off using the real handles off the tools and making the blades, because I was a welder. And then I suddenly thought, hang on, this is a much more interesting way to do it, to use the blade and make the handle, and then I had to teach myself woodwork, which is basically what I did. So it took me a while to get into it just because I had to learn how to do it.
And how do you physically manipulate the tools and materials?
The materials, well, they are really carvings. I mean, I've always been a sort of constructor in my life. I've always put things together. And even when I'm making these sculptures, they are basically constructed, but they're carved at the same time. So, I mean, the wood stock that I have, every piece of sculpture I make is made out of a 2-inch plank, a 2-inch oak plank, flat plank. And how I go about it is I buy what they call a butt, which is the trunk of an oak tree, and then I get the guys in the sawmill to plank it up to 2-inch planks, and then I dry it, because the only way I can afford to buy it is if it's green, straight out of the tree. So it's an inch a year, so you store it for 2 years because it's 2 inches thick, and then you can start to use it. So basically what I've done is everything gets cut out of a 2-inch plank, and I usually draw the things out full scale on paper, and then cut them out and transfer them directly onto the plank so I can work out how to do it. And if in some pieces you will see instances of where I've used wood that seems to be thicker than 2 inches, well, if you look carefully, that's where I've joined it together. I've basically laminated pieces together to get a thicker piece. And so they're carved. There is no bending involved, no heat at all. I'm much more interested in the process of carving. And I think one's relationship to wood develops as you carve, and obviously as I've been working 15 years or whatever in it, my skill level has gone up. I had very limited skill, but I realised early on that if you're going to make something look like a real tool, even if it was a surreal tool, your skill level had to be at the level that a tool would be made at, and most tools are made pretty well, so I had to learn pretty fast. Obviously the tool, I've used the tool as a kind of metaphor for the landscape. The tool stands in for the landscape. It's also a memorial for the landscape, because in the 50s I can remember going to visit my uncles, and they were basically working the land by hand. The tools that they used were hand tools. They didn't have huge machines, they didn't have the big tractors and whatever. And their relationship with the land was very close, and in a way less destructive than what we do now. And a lot of the clearing of the hedges and stuff that everyone hates came about because the machines were so big, they demanded big fields. And I felt that if one used the tool as a metaphor for that moment when man's relationship to the land was much more sympathetic perhaps than it is now, then it's almost an environmental issue here, what we have here. I mean, people think of the outside world as being a natural landscape. It is not. It's a man-made landscape. And as we advance and we use bigger machines, bigger combine harvesters, whatever, we change that landscape fundamentally, particularly getting rid of the hedges, but trees as well. I mean, where are all the trees that we used to grow everywhere in the fields? So I think I use the tool as a metaphor for this thing. But also it seemed to me that the Norfolk landscape is land, but it's also churches, because the churches are everywhere. 721 medieval churches in Norfolk. It's a hell of a lot of buildings. But the thing about the buildings is that they grew up out of the landscape. And Norwich in particular, during the Middle Ages, was the second city. It was the richest city, in the country apart from London. And that richness came from the land. And all these guys who were making lots of money out of sheep or whatever, the wool, they ploughed it, because they were worried about the afterlife, they ploughed it into the churches. So the money from the land built the churches. That's the point I'm making. And it felt to me like, well, the tools built the churches then. You cut out the middleman, you've got the tool building the churches. So why not make the tool speak to the architecture of the church by making things that are to do with the architecture of the church out of tools? One of the things I do for pleasure and out of interest for my sculpture is go to Italy. And one of the reasons I go to Italy is because I'm very interested in the way that the Catholic Church has organised some of the objects within their interiors. And one of the things that I picked up on quite early on was this idea of a reliquary. Now, for those of you who don't know what a reliquary is, it's basically a container. It's a box that contains a relic. The fingernail of a saint or whatever it is, because it might be completely bogus. But the fact of the matter is, the people who put it in these incredibly elaborate, usually gold, bejeweled boxes, believed that this thing that was inside had magic powers. I mean, that it was an absolute belief. And because once people establish that relationship to an object, inevitably over the years, the object does take on that, because people have that reverence for it. And there are places in Italy, I'm thinking of Padua in particular, where there's a tomb in Padua of St. Anthony. Now, he may or may not be in the tomb, but the fact is the tomb, women, middle-aged women, queue up to kiss it. And I thought, this is a really intense relationship that these people have with this object. Now, a reliquary is a box. So I wanted to make a box using my language. So the boxes that you see in the exhibition are basically symbolic spades. They are spades. The box, six-sided, the box is always six-sided spades enclosing a magic space is the idea. So the internal thing, even though there's nothing in them, it's the idea of the box and the fact that I'm using spades to make this religious experience happen, this magic bit. And I think that, for me, has become just recently the most interesting aspect of where my work is. And the most recent work here, and it will be the most recent work in the show at King's Lynn, will be the reliquary. The idea of the magicness of the church becoming part of the landscape.
Do you ever change the heads of the tools? For example, the spades behind you are
Yes.
very shiny.
Yes, well, what happened was, I was making work, as I said, with old tools that I got from my family and from various sources. And one of the things that people kept saying to me when I was showing them is that they responded to them on a nostalgic level. They were saying, oh, yes, I remember that my granddad had one of those, you know, and I got a bit fed up with it, actually, because it was almost like I was making something out of Gressenhall, you know, like a museum exhibit that was to do with the past, not to do with the sculpture. And although people enjoyed the work and found it funny, which is an essential quality of my work, it is humorous, it's intended to be humorous, they also responded to the oldness of the tools. So I got to the stage when I thought, I mean, I'm not totally disinterested in old tools, but I thought I wanted to introduce something that would make it a much more clinical thing. So you can't say it, you just take that element out of the mix. The recipe, I wanted to be a more formal sculptural recipe rather than a kind of a Gressenhall museum, this is what they used in the old days kind of experience, which some people were having with the pieces. So I started introducing the stainless steel stuff. Obviously I don't make the stainless steel, I just buy it from Lidl's, but it actually introduced an element which I actually found quite interesting because they are very beautiful. I mean, the stainless steel is such a beautiful, and they're made in such a beautiful way, and it's almost decorative, it's almost like jewellery, that stainless steel, because it's so bright. And I like that because it's in a sense very contemporary. It has that kind of the moment that the older stuff doesn't. So yeah, I mean the choice of tools is absolutely intentional. There was a distinct step away from the old tools towards the new, yes, because it was a conscious thing. I wanted to get the recipe changed.
I've noticed that you incorporate themes in your work, some of your previous sculptures. You take
a long series. I work in long series, and I go back to series. I've always felt that if you have a good idea, it's almost certain that you'll never work it out with one piece. And what I like to do, because I have the luxury of time to do it, is to run a series. And when I sort of start running out of ways of handling it, I leave it alone. I mean, there's a long series called Tool Skater. There's a long series called Daisy Chain. And daisy chain is, you know, what it is, and the idea of interlocking tools keeps coming back. So every now and again I think, I've got an idea for a daisy chain, then I'll make daisy chain 22 or whatever it is. Do you see what I mean? So there's a kind of long series, because I've always felt it's a much more rewarding way of exploring an idea. You get an idea, you make a sculpture, and then you come back to it later and later and later, and gradually you build up this quite sophisticated, complex relationship with that idea. And you know, and that seems to be a particularly rewarding way of doing it.
Have you ever reached a point in your work where you felt that you've used your themes to their limits?
Yes, I mean, inevitably that happens. It's bound to happen. That doesn't mean to say that I would not necessarily go back, but there are certain things that I wouldn't do now that I did 15 years ago, because I would find the idea too trite, too simple. I like ideas now that are much more complex, because I've become much more, as it were, involved with the whole process of that relationship that I've just been discussing. So I would say yes, definitely. The one-off sculpture that just explores an idea, you know, like you see something on the wall there, that's it. I would never go back to anything like that, because, you know, it seems to be very finite and not open-ended. I like things that have resonances that carry on about this world I inhabit, which is Norfolk.
Can you talk a bit more about the work that will be in this exhibition?
Of course. The work in this exhibition, which is pretty much represented in the studio right now, has moved on from my last show in the Red Barn, in the sense that my work now is much more formal. It's not so, if I can use the word zoomorphic, it's not so much about animals now like it was. There was a phase 5 years ago when I got very interested in the suggestion of something animalistic that was in the tools. I'm not interested in that now. That's come to an end. But what I am interested in, I'm still interested in this metaphor, but I'm much more interested now in the architectural reference. And that architectural reference I'm hoping to stress when I have the show at the Fermoy. Yes, that's the kind of thing I want to try and explore. And because the Fermoy is a very formal, very clean, cold architectural space, I'm hoping to use that space. The Red Barn has its own character, which I used last time, almost like my granddad's shed, you know, which is an image I had from my childhood, because he had lots of tools, and it was like a mystery tour. When you went in there, it was a surreal experience. So that's what I wanted to recreate in the Red Barn. But now in the Fermoy, I wanted to to try and establish some much more formal relationship between architecture, landscape and my surreal works.